And so we see the Healthy Farm Index as a planning and monitoring tool that ultimately may increase pro-environmental behaviors. And what I want to talk about here is how we kind of walk through the Healthy Farm Index and focus on objectives, targets, and indicators. These, again, like we mentioned before, there's a couple of ways to actually use the Healthy Farm Index. One is the extension NEB guide that should be available soon, and hopefully in the next month. And this has a lot of detailed information about the indicators and kind of walks you through it. It is focused in some respects on Midwestern systems, but we've designed it to be flexible for whatever agricultural system you're working within. What I want to talk about today is our web version of that, which follows a similar structure as the NEB guide, but is a little bit more dynamic in how a farmer or planner or land use manager could interact with it. When putting together the Healthy Farm Index, we've kind of set what some of the objectives are. We focused on environmental, social, and economic objectives. Objectives are broad, value-driven statements, and so these can be everything from conserve biodiversity to enhancing engagement with the community or with your neighbor or with the land itself. We focus on how can we decrease expenses or increase stability on the farm. We've chosen on the web version to focus these objectives into biodiversity and ecosystem services to kind of align with some of the concepts we discussed earlier, where we want to conserve plant and associated biodiversity. So can we conserve crop diversity? Can we conserve bird diversity? And we want to kind of monitor that change over time, and then ultimately want to enhance food production, maintain that essential economic component of the farm, improve soil and water quality, and ultimately improve satisfaction with the farm itself. Within those objectives, we've gone through and selected potential indicators that we think reflect the priorities of the farm, but that are flexible enough to work on any farm and are relatively easy to monitor. You can spend a lot of time and money getting better data, but we wanted indicators that were either already part of a typical farm monitoring or management process, or that were relatively easy to collect. And so we started out, as we mentioned before, interested in the trade-offs between bird diversity and crop yields. We quickly realized that that did not capture the system of a farm and all the potential indicators that were within there. And so we added a number of other indicators to the Healthy Farm Index. And more information of these is available in the different papers. And we'll kind of walk through some of them when we look at them on the farm. With the Healthy Farm Index, the indicators are provided. What the farmer has to do is choose what the specific targets they have and what they want to reach for those. So what I want to do here is switch from the PowerPoint slides here and actually go to the web version of the tool. The Healthy Farm Index calculator can be found at this website on the bottom for the Organic Center. And I will open that here. And this is the main homepage for the Healthy Farm Index Biodiversity Calculator on the Organic Center's website. If you scroll down to the bottom of this page, you can either click on the image or click on the link, and it will open up a web app version of the Healthy Farm Index. The index is written to and designed to kind of walk you through the process of monitoring and planning for biodiversity and ecosystem services on your farm. The focus first is here on the left-hand side, and we talk about first here how it works. So there's 3 stages in doing this. There's selection of weights, selection of targets, and then entering the current data for your farm. The weights represent the objectives that we talked about before, so the value-driven statements. The targets represent for each indicator where you want to be. And then finally, the current data represents where your farm is, and this is what you will put in at the end. The intention is to walk through each of these stages deliberately and take your time thinking about your farm, thinking about your priorities, your values, and kind of where you want to be in the long run. So I'll walk through the process once here, but it's meant to be a deliberative, thoughtful process. So it takes a little bit of time. There is some information in there. We've tried to limit the number of indicators and the number of choices, but ultimately it does take a little bit of thinking in order to get through. So we're going to go here first to the selection of weights. The weights represent those values that we talked about earlier, where how important is something to you. There are two tabs for weights, one for biodiversity and a second for ecosystem services. And these reflect how important each indicator is. So this is that value statement. So you could say, for me, it is important to have a high crop diversity. So I'm going to raise this. Having livestock as part of my operation is less important to me. I like birds, but I find plants are more important, and pollinators are essential. Number of landscape types, I'm okay with something relatively simple. Percent of my farm is non-crop is challenging, but I do like rare habitats. So you can go here and then you can submit those weights, and it gives you a value here of 104 and kind of shows how those weights are distributed across. So, crops and pollinators are more important on your farm than livestock and percent non-crop. However, this provides a check that your weights need to equal 100. This forces you to kind of recognize that there are trade-offs in what you might manage a farm for. So we might take a little bit here off of crops. We might take a little bit off of pollinators, a little bit off here, and then we can submit those weights again, but we came in at just under, so I'm going to pull my pollinators back up. And that's close enough. Next, we move to ecosystem services, and we do that same thing, and so we might say yields are important. Having different market opportunities on my farm, so having multiple sources of income is less important. I do think it's important that waterways are buffered to keep clean water. Protection of my fields, continuous living covers, less important to me. I would like to be satisfied, and ownership is key. Here, clearly we've come in a little bit high, so we have to come back and kind of take some of the prioritization off of these. And again, as long as you're close to 100, you're okay. For more information on these specific indicators, we do have a resources page here at the end, which has some discussion of the indicator selection and the NEB guide, and we'll be writing another brochure that kind of complements that complements the web guide here, which can provide more information on individual indicators. Alright, so we're happy with our weights. Next, we're going to move on to our targets, and these are two more tabs over here. Tab targets for biodiversity and targets for ecosystem services. These targets represent where you want your farm to be in the future. Like, what would be the ideal number of crops on that you plant? If you're a corn, soybean farmer who maybe includes alfalfa periodically, maybe you want to move from 3 to 5. If you currently have pigs and chickens, maybe you want to add goats and something else, and so 4. Here, how many bird species can you identify on your land? We'll say you can identify 5 plants. You can, you would identify 5 now, and you would like to be up to 20. Plants, you would also like to be near 20. Pollinators, you're happy with 5. Landscape types, you're at 4 now. You'd like to be at 8. You'd like to actually maybe have 30% of your farm as non-crop habitat. And then currently you only have a small percent of it as rare, but you'd like to see that increased. So you can go through, you can submit those targets, and then we come back here for targets for ecosystem services. What yields compared to the average? You want to be at 100% of your average. You're gonna put your market opportunities at 1, because that's kind of where you are right now, and you're happy with that. You want to see 80% of your waterways buffered. You want all of your fields to be protected. 40% under continuous living cover. You want to be more satisfied with your farm, and you'd like to own 100%. You can submit your targets. And the last thing we do is we enter the current data for your farm. So we'll say you plant 3 crops, you have 1 species of livestock, 10 birds, 15 plants, and this is the first time you have to take real data from your farm and go back and submit that. Here, number of pollinators, landscape types, percent non-crop, and percent rare. We do the same thing for ecosystem services. Your yields this year were a little below average. You're at 1 for your market opportunities. Your buffering, say 60%. 80% of your fields are protected. Continuous living cover, you're at 60. You're happy with your farm, but not all the way, and you own 60%. Hit calculate our healthy farm index values, and we can look at some of our scores here. So this summarizes where you're doing well on biodiversity and where you have some work to go. So the higher the bar, the closer it is to your target. If it hits 1, it means you've reached that value. So we can look here, our percent non-crop and our pollinators. We've hit our targets. Some of these other ones we have some ways to go. So our livestock is one we want to improve, and percent rare. We can look at the same numbers for ecosystem services. We've actually already surpassed our target for continuous living cover, so we're doing well there. But we would like to own more of our land. Our yields are slightly below where we want to be. This kind of gives you, looking at these figures, helps you recognize what you're doing well and where you want to improve. What you could do next is say, okay, I'm going to choose one of these and focus on improving that. So I'm going to focus on waterways that are buffered here, number 3. And for the next year, this will be my conservation or management priority. We've set up a way to summarize and report these results. This page can be printed off and included in your annual organic inspection. It can be printed off and filed away and kind of compare for later. We're hoping to set up a way for you to actually submit this data, and we can monitor and help maintain that for you in the long run, but we're not quite there yet. But the table here gives you 3 values, and so it gives you scores for biodiversity, ecosystem services, and then an overall healthy farm index. These 3 scores represent the weights, the targets, and the current biodiversity for your farm. And so they're an aggregate multi-criteria index. A higher score says you are closer to your goal, but a higher score doesn't mean it's necessarily better than another farm. This score reflects the objectives, the values, the targets of an individual farm. And so you have to be cautious about how you report those numbers. We also have a table that summarizes all the data that you input here, where for each of the 15 indicators, the weights that you set, the targets for this particular year, and then where that current data is. And then it sums out the score here for what that is. This score is what's used in the biodiversity and the Healthy Farm Index scores. These targets and current values are what we saw previous when we're looking at this biodiversity and ecosystem service scores. So what's next? Well, first, we'd actually, if you're interested in helping us understand how using the Healthy Farm Index changes knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, and ultimately changes the adoption, increases the adoption of pro-environmental behaviors, we'd love to have you participate in our long-term project here. And so you can click this link. It actually has a space to submit these 3 values, which will help us track your farm over time. But on a more individual level, we see this as a process where you might use the Healthy Farm Index on an annual basis. It's meant to take half an hour to an hour to kind of walk through and complete. But the thought is that you would come back and reflect on those values each year and say, okay, in 2016, this is what I was doing well at. In 2017, I made these changes, and here's how my scores changed. I think the long-term process of doing this is what's going to change some of the social norms, the perceived behavioral control, and ultimately the habits. The question often comes up is, how do I accomplish that? How do I get those particular targets? We've put some resources here from a couple of different agencies, and we'll continue to build this up as we see good resources. The Wild Farm Alliance has a nice brochure that talks about what are some practices you can do. So ideally, you could implement some of the practices from the Wild Farm Alliance or from the NRCS or some of these other sources, and then use the index to track the success of your management decisions. So, kind of summarizing what we have here in the Healthy Farm Index, the online calculator is set up to help you track changes over time. It doesn't tell you what to do. Like we said, we've tried to put some information under resources in order for you to get there, but really its value is tracking that change over time. And we see this as part of, like we said, an adaptive management process where, here we're helping you plan and evaluate kind of what's been done, where do you want to be, what are your indicators, what are some outcomes you'd like to see. These other resources can help you do that, but then we can help you evaluate, the index can help you evaluate the success of that. In reality, you're going to have to adjust, and then you do this again, and then you go back and evaluate and learn. But by monitoring these changes over time, you'll be able to better communicate how effective you were at those particular practices.